Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Please mute while you're coming in. Take a minute to mute yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Give us just a second to let everyone in.
What are some of the things when you look back to those days, school, high school?
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our chapter chat. My name is Sam Fletcher. I'm the executive director of the New York State chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. I am thrilled to have one of my great colleagues with us, Kari Tabag. Terry, I just combined your names. Kari does many things with us here at the chapter. She sits in our diversity committee. She does a lot of continuing education training for us. She's my partner in the Racial Justice Forum. And I was thrilled she was going to do this chat tonight, really focusing on the uptick in violence against our Asian loved ones. So I'm going to hand it over to Amelia right now, and she's going to tell you how you're going to interact.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to quickly go over how we're going to use Zoom. I'm sure everyone knows how to use Zoom, but I'm just going to do a little refresher of how we're going to use it together today. First, I want to let you all know that we have turned on the live closed captioning. So if you need closed captioning, you should be able to turn that on. If the words are in your way, you can click on that and drag it anywhere in the screen that you'd like it to be. So if it's covering over something that you'd like to see, feel free to move that so it's out of your way. You can also use your reactions throughout the presentation. If you hover just your cursor over the Zoom bar, you're going to have the option to do those reactions. Please feel free to do those throughout the presentation. I'm also going to say that during the presentation, we'd like you to stay muted. There will become a time where this will be primarily a discussion and we want to hear from you. So please feel comfortable to unmute yourselves and engage in this conversation. But during the presentation itself, we're just going to ask that you keep those questions or comments to the chat box. And as I mentioned the chat box, I want to ask you to write in where you're coming from, what state are you in, which country are you in, why are you coming to this program? Is there anything that you're bringing with you? So we'd love to hear why folks are here and where they're coming from in the first place. The last thing I want to mention is that this is not a CE program. So our chapter chats are ways to, as we say, socially connect while physically distancing. It's kind of anything and everything social work, but this is not a CE program. We do have many CEs available through the New York State chapter. You can get all of the CEs for your renewal of your license for free with membership. And we will have CEs actually with Kari in the future on this topic. But this particular program is not a CE program. So thank you all again, and I'm going to hand it over to Kari for our chapter chat today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Amelia and Sam. Happy to be here. I'm out here on Long Island in New York. I work in Queens, so I'm all over, but I'm from New York. So I'm really happy that everybody's able to be here and be present. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. So this is me. My name's Kari, and I am a social worker. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to begin by taking a 30-second moment of silence to honor those who were killed in the shooting in Georgia. Thank you very much. I also would like to wish those, well, not wish you, but I would also just like to acknowledge Yom HaShoah, which will begin into this evening at sundown. It's the Holocaust Day of Remembrance, and it's also World Health Day. So, if we can also just thank our ancestors. And I would also like to read a land acknowledgement. It's important that we acknowledge the land that we have borrowed, and that we thank our ancestors, and that we pay them acknowledgement and in memory. So let us respectfully acknowledge the Lenape people, who were the stewards and protectors of this land we occupy in this moment. We would like to pay respect to the Lenape elders, both past and present, who were the keepers of their language and culture. We recognize that this land we are meeting on was unlawfully and brutally seized from its rightful inhabitants through genocide and displacement. At this time, we would also like to acknowledge the lives of those enslaved and their descendants whose forced labor contributed to the wealth of this nation. We honor their sacrifice and recognize the violent and brutal nature of their capture, trade, and travail. We recognize that a nation was built on their backs, a sacrifice that to this day has not been remunerated nor adequately regarded. Please take a moment to consider the lives, culture, and legacy of these groups as we aspire to honor them and pay our respect for their contributions to our society. So I invite every participant to acknowledge your own ancestors at this time. Take a deep breath in. Exhale. One more time in. And exhale. I need to remind you to breathe, because this brings us to our next point, that this topic will bring discomfort, if not to some, but to all. And it's important that you do take care of yourself. If you need to turn the computer monitor off, if you need to get a drink of water, if you need to run to the restroom, or if you need to exit out and come back, please do so. Do what you need to do to take care of yourself. This may kick up some uncomfortable feelings and emotions for you. So I want to start with a video that was posted to YouTube in February 2021. And some of you may recognize who this the person in the video is.
We're tired. We're tired of our cries and anguish not being heard.
Show me what community looks like. Show me what.
We're tired of our pain being overlooked. We're tired of keeping our heads down or not making any trouble when our elders are being assaulted, stabbed, and killed. Wouldn't you be? The hate-fueled attacks on Asian Americans are disturbing, but why are we surprised? For many of us as Asian Americans in this country, we know what it feels like to be told we don't belong, that we're perpetually foreigners. And even though others try to minimize us to one entity, we represent so many different cultures, so many different backgrounds, so many different stories. What do you think happens next in a society where we've normalized xenophobia at the highest levels?
Trump's gonna you. You need to leave.
Oh, you do not talk
No,
about
you
Jeff
need
like
to
that.
leave.
What's wrong? You need to leave.
Asian piece of
Oh my God.
People assign blame to those who don't deserve it. People are emboldened to vandalize Asian-owned businesses. People feel like it's okay to yell at you in public based on your race. Normalizing hate speech stokes the flames of racism and leads to an 84-year-old Thai grandfather lying helpless on the streets of San Francisco, left to die after being attacked. 84 years old. The next week, a 64-year-old grandmother assaulted in San Jose and a Filipino-American man slashed across the face in New York City. We're tired of this hateful violence. We're tired of talking about it, but we're not done speaking out. Far from it. Listen to your AAPI brothers and sisters. We must learn to love one another, to hear one another's anguish and actually care. Don't overlook the pain those around you are experiencing on a daily basis. Reach out to offer your support, to educate others, and let's put an end to this violence and hate together.
So some of you may recognize that as person is Jeremy Lin. He is a basketball player for, I believe, the Warriors. And if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I'm not really a basketball fan. Sorry, I'm learning. So, but I really appreciated that video. And the sad thing is, is that after he posted that video, he was called coronavirus by one of his fellow players on the court. So it really speaks volumes. So I wanted to just go over, we're going through the introduction, and I want to, go over the geography, historical background, demographics. There's a lot to cover in 30 minutes, so I hope I don't go too fast. I really need to just go over the model minority myth with you, as well as the stereotypes, and most importantly, how to help. So with that, let's get moving and grooving. Okay. This is not new. The racial acts of hatred against Asian Americans has a long legacy of xenophobia towards people of Asian descent. I will also be reviewing some terms that you may or may not have heard, and if you have heard of them, it's always helpful to have a refresher. So for those who are unfamiliar with the term xenophobia, it refers to fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners, or of anything that is strange or foreign. And another term that I'd like to go over with you is Asian American Pacific Islander. That was also in the video that I just showed, or Asian Pacific Islander. You might see these acronyms, but really, unfortunately, these acronyms came from around the 80s with the Pan-ethnic movement. And I'm going to go over those terms too. It was a student movement, actually. Woohoo! I love when students do that kind of stuff. But what happened was it really left out some important significance for other groups. So basically, if you look at these two terms, Asian American Pacific Islander and Asian Pacific Islander, that promotes colonization. And the Pacific Islander communities actually present with significant health and socioeconomic disparities versus other groups. So really, the correct acronym is Native American and Pacific Islander. It's something that I recently learned because it really always tugged at my heartstrings, like I knew it wasn't right. And I recently learned, and I wanted to share that knowledge with you. Another thing that I would like to share with you is that it's really important that when we're describing and talking to our clients and just in our places of work and in our daily lives, I ask you to please stop using of Asian, and you can insert the ethnicity, descent, and also the hyphenation of Asian American. What the phrasing perpetuates is a forever foreigner stereotype and offering the diversity of what is Asian American. So whether a person is a citizen of this country or not doesn't matter, right? So you hear someone saying, well, they're Asian, and then, or you hear people saying they're Asian American. So it doesn't matter when describing people who live and work in this country. If there's ambiguity, then people say Asian and Asian American. So, or Filipino or Filipino American. So let's try to make it more specific. By not doing that, it enables invisibility and separates from the American narrative. It promotes that otherness that we'll talk about as well. So for example, I'm Filipino American. Somebody could say that they're Vietnamese. It's what they choose to identify as. But putting them into that, that pool, and and we're going to talk about that a little bit further, but this is just something that I wanted to start with as well. So anti-Asian sentiments, they've started since the start, they've spiked, right? They've increased since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we're seeing are physical assaults, verbal harassments, people are coughed, spit on. We see microaggressions that have definitely increased. They've always, again, these have always been here, but they've really increased. Kicked out of shops and restaurants, discrimination at jobs, property vandalism, we're seeing that. And at the onset of the pandemic, since the onset of the pandemic, 3,800 self-reported hate incidents of racism and discrimination against Asian Americans, with 68% directed at Asian American women. And the resource, I'll repeat that at the end, is stopaaphihate.org. So you'll see acronyms are different, right? But when we go into our chats and our continuing ed webinars, it's always important to learn how we can best represent a population. And as you can see, there's so many discrepancies. So take it in, take what you can from it and apply it. And also between these 2 years, 2019 and 2021, hate crimes increased against Asian Americans by nearly 150%. I mean, that's mind blowing. And what we are also seeing is that what we're forgetting, and what a lot of, what we need to note, we take note of, is that a large number of essential workers are within the Asian community. Why? Why is this happening? What's the reason? And I think that's one that happens for a lot of people. The other thing I want to add just really quick, because I have like my notes in front of me. I also wanted to add in that Asian Americans of lower socioeconomic status don't fit a model minority stereotype. So when we look at essential workers, they're not just the model minority stereotype of doctors and nurses, right? And physical therapists and in the STEM field. They also work in low wage industries, restaurants, salons, housekeeping, factories. That makes them more vulnerable. And Asian women, like the victims of the shootings in Atlanta, Georgia, have historically been susceptible to sexual and physical violence. Within this community, we also have biracial, multiracial, LGBTQ+, and there is gender fluidity, right? So we need to take all of that in, kind of like I'm presenting this huge psychosocial, right? So again, we go to why. It's a systemic problem. Some, not all, because the list goes on, but the ones that really are at the top: racism, white supremacy, misogyny, colonialism, which is really like national oppression, and of course, capitalism. There's xenophobia again, and we saw that in the video. Go back to your country. Basically, if you look at studies, that do qualitative research, some of the themes in their taxonomy, such as microaggression theory, there's that perpetual foreigner stereotype, right? That comes up. And that's why it's so important. I'm just going to keep going back and forth. That's why it's so important when we use these acronyms that we don't reinforce this perpetual foreigner stereotype. And also, of course, as we saw and heard in the video, there was unfortunately the Trump administration that did not help in referencing COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. And there's other terms as well that have been used. So now let's look at the geography. Okay, so as you can see, we have 6 regions: South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, West Asia, Central Asia, and North Asia. And I'm going to read some of it because I am aware that some people are on the phone and you may not be able to look at the PowerPoint slides. And if you look, and you'll see that a majority of the Asian populations, the largest that have immigrated here to the United States: Chinese largest, second largest South Asian Indian, and then Filipino is the 3rd largest. It's something very interesting about Filipinos is that they have many years of colonization. And so they have Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, American ×2 with colonization. And they also have indigenous cultures as well. They started one of the tribes before the Spanish colonized. For example, there was the Negrito tribes. So that's just giving you something that I know, like I cannot take your narrative away from you. For those who represent and are Asian that are participating today, I'm not here to take away your story from you. I'm just giving an example based on my positionality. So I just wanted to show the geography of Asia and how large it is. And so what we have is we have people that are receiving, or that are victims of racial acts of hatred that really are just because you look a certain way, right? And we saw that also in another historical moment that I'm going to go over as well. So I just wanted to give you that snapshot of how large Asia is. And now here is the historical background. And we look at a snippet, and there's so many, but I really wanted to just pull out the ones that I think most people may have heard and that are most familiar with. And when we hear about, we look at when the immigration started, which a lot of people don't realize that it started back in 1587, when the first Filipinos arrived to the United States. Mexican, that was the Filipino-Mexican galleon trade. And then 1848, when the Chinese laborers came over, you had the gold rush. So they came over to help with building the railroads and the gold rush as well. And a lot of people skip the second one. And this one I really want to just focus on a little bit. It's called the Page Act. That was passed in 1875, which prohibited the entry of East Asian women. And so that's the earliest example of formal immigration exclusion. And literally what it said is that women who are entering, I'm quoting, women who are entering
for lewd or lascivious reasons, that's the exact phrasing, would be banned. The assumption was that women coming from Asia were largely engaged in prostitution, and whether or not were is almost besides the issue. That was the first federal law to restrict immigration in general, and it specifically targeted Asian women who were believed to be entering the United States for prostitution or polygamy. Polygamy refers to marrying more than one. So a man or a woman can marry more than one woman. Chinese women were seen as a threat to the institution of marriage and a danger to, at the time, white males. They were even stigmatized as being unclean and giving white male children as young as 12 syphilis. Can you imagine? That was the accusation. And so by identifying and excluding Chinese women as prostitutes, they again, back in 1875, they were focusing on Chinese because that was the largest population of the immigrants coming in. The law prevented the birth of Chinese American children and stunted the growth of Chinese American communities. So basically in itself, the law targeted Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians. At the time, they referred to it as Orientals, which we no longer use that, meaning it had implications for all Asian groups, right? And if you've wondered why there were only Asian male laborers and few Asian women, it's because they didn't want Asian people to reproduce, populate, and threaten whiteness. Sound familiar? It's also important to recognize that many of these women might have been sex workers, but this was their way to earn money, to leave bad family situations or migrate. Sex work was work then, and sex work is work now. We cannot stigmatize a group for doing what they need to do to survive. So I just really wanted to go over that because a lot of people haven't heard of the Page Act. Unfortunately, with the shootings in Atlanta, it has come to the forefront, thank goodness, but it had to take something like that. And that was another thing too, that, you know, I myself involved in the Asian community, we were, you know, since the COVID pandemic, racial acts of hatred have started to spike, and we knew this was coming. I hear this from a lot of Asian colleagues as well. We knew this was going to happen, and we felt that nobody was listening, and we were trying to get help, and it took something like this for this to happen. So if you look at the history, then we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Nobody knows about the Watson. A lot of people, unless you're Filipino, you really don't know about the Watsonville riots. If you know about it, I high five you. January 19th to January 23rd, violent assaults on Filipino-American farm workers by locals opposed to immigration, highlighting socioeconomic tensions in California. And of course, there's the internment of Japanese Americans, February 19th, 1942 to March 20th, 1946. And that was mainly on the West Coast, but it was in the United States. And they tried with the Magnuson Act. They tried to repeal them. And then they also tried again with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, otherwise known as the Hart-Celler Act. And then, of course, we had the terrorist attacks, September 11th, 2001, which changed American policies, immigration, privacy, and ways South Asian Americans were perceived and threatened. SARS 2003 and COVID 2019. And it's jarring looking at a timeline, and this isn't even a thorough timeline. It's what I could basically fit on a PowerPoint slide, and the ones that really are at the forefront. But if we dig further into history, there's even more that we don't know about. So there's the terms that I said I was going to go over: pan-ethnic versus monolithic. So you may hear of these and say, well, what does that mean? Pan-ethnicity basically is just looking at, you're taking one racial or ethnic group and putting them into one, versus monolithic. Asians are monolithic, okay? We represent 24 to 26 distinct groups, right? We're highly diverse. We have multiple layers, like I mentioned, colonization. Some are, rather than saying Asian, we can say Filipino American, Vietnamese American, right? And the list goes on and on. We vary in our country of origin, our immigration, where we have been deported with ICE, and really, unfortunately, that has not been brought to the media's attention. There have been people that have had to be deported to other countries in Asia, but we hear about other countries, but we don't hear about Asians that were deported as well. We have different generational status. We have a variety of dialects, and I'm sure other Asian subgroups as well have many different dialects. Some have different provinces, and each province has their own dialect. We all have different cultural values and norms, class position, religion, and gender. We all have distinct experiences and histories. So if you're working with a family or a client or a coworker, family worker, the list goes on and on. Because somebody is Vietnamese doesn't necessarily mean they have the same experience as somebody else that you may or may not be aware of that's Vietnamese. Think of all of these different factors that make each person's experience different. Asian Americans were viewed as a threat. You may or may not have heard of yellow peril, which basically refers to Asians were seen as unclean and unfit for citizenship in America. They're dirty, yellow peril. In the early 20th century, Filipinos were denigrated for their alleged unclean and uncivilized bodies by American officials in the Philippines. Therein is the colonization. So, keeping track of the time, I know we're running a little bit behind. I want to go over the stereotypes of Asian Americans. Our phenotypes that we have seen, eye shape, hair color, skin color, body image, petite, supposed to be petite, tiny, small chested. The media portrays Asian women, and you think about the movies, you've heard these terms, Dragon Lady, China Doll, Lotus Blossom, oh, Kung Fu Master. And actually now, ironically, they're coming out with a show, and I shook my head, and I think they call it Kung Fu Master. And I was just like, oh God, how's that going to affect us? Women, and we look at fetishism, exoticization. Yeah, it's one of those words that I have a hard time saying. We all have those. Sexual objectification, mail order brides. Asian women are supposed to be hypersexualized, submissive. And I'm going to be, I hope I don't offend anyone and be inappropriate, but I'm going to be blatant. And what do they say about Asian women and their vaginas? Come on, let's call it like we see it. Fetishization is racism. It is white supremacy. It is hate. It is violence against Asian women. Asian American women, or Asian women rather, in the United States and among the aged are the targets. But that's not to say that Asian American men are not targets as well. In Georgia, the underlying assumption, which angers me, is that the women that they were engaged in sex work, and the shooter believed they engaged in sex work without question. Just because a woman works in and I hate this term too, massage parlor or a spa, doesn't mean that she gives happy endings and that she does that. And that's something that is very angering as well. A lot of them, yes, are victims of human/sex trafficking victims. And also we want to talk about human trafficking, because if we look at those who are in healthcare that come from their other countries to come here to work, to make money and send back to their home, unfortunately, they fall victim to human trafficking and possibly, unfortunately, sex trafficking. If we look at the stereotypes of Asian men, the generalizations are, oh, they're all martial artists, they have small penises, they're cold, but they're competent, and they're all really nerdy because they all are smart with in the STEM field. These are the assumptions, these are the stereotypes and generalizations. And then we have the biggest one, which is called the model minority myth, which in 1966, Peterson, who worked for Time magazine, coined the term praising Japanese Americans, placing emphasis on their education and financial endeavors among Asian Americans. Look at the Asian Americans, look at the Japanese Americans, how they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, they don't complain, they're successful, they're smart, they're hardworking, and they're resilient. And then, of course, he put the Asian Americans in a position of oppression, internal oppression, in which they were then put up against whites as well as other races. The cultural expectation is that we're all smart, we're good in math, science, technology. Just saying, I suck at math, by the way. Wealthy, we're all hardworking, self-reliant, living the American dream. We don't complain, we're docile and submissive, obedient and uncomplaining, spiritually enlightened, and we're never in need of assistance. Therein lies part of the reason why we're also being victimized. Therein also is that pressure to conform to white elitist social norms, and we're pitted against the other colors of community to benefit whiteness, to benefit white supremacy. It silences us. We're forced to accept a victimized approach to the issues leading to internalized racial oppression. And then we have limited language proficiency. So there are studies that show, for example, And this was the study involving students, that the ability to disclose and report racial assaults and seek out help and support, that might play a role. Limited language proficiency, even if the person is bilingual, multilingual, and can speak English fine. This is something that also plays a role. That's very difficult. Asian Americans of lower socioeconomic status, they don't fit the model minority stereotype, and they're more likely to work in low-wage industries. Like I mentioned before, restaurants, salons, housekeeping, and facilities, making them more vulnerable. Asian women, like the victims of the shootings, have historically been susceptible to sexual and physical violence. So you'll notice that I repeat some things because it's so important that I do that. Asian Americans I'm sorry, I have been the closed captioning covered it. They're invisible and marginalized. Both are vulnerable. So you have the two socioeconomic statuses, right? Those who are under the model minority myth with the socioeconomic status that are high up there, and then those who are marginalized. So we're not only invisible, we're marginalized. So you're darned if you do, you're darned if you don't. If you fit the model minority stereotype, you're seen as invisible because you don't complain. If you work in lower socioeconomic status, you're marginalized. So we're both vulnerable, those two groups, which leads to silent suffering, stigma, invisibility, vulnerability. We start to see with mental health, and this is where a lot of ears may perk up because I'm sure there's a lot of clinicians and people who work with who need to know this. We're going to be doing continuing ed on this a little bit further. I just want to give an introduction. Asian Americans present with a low, or Asians rather, present with a low level of help-seeking behavior and seeking professional mental health services. They tend to underutilize mental health services and usually seek non-traditional support services within their communities, such as an aged member of the family, or maybe a member of their clergy. Some people feel more comfortable going to their priest, right? Or somebody that they feel comfortable with, and maybe that they feel comfortable with in their house of worship. When they do utilize mental health services, there are high dropout rates. Risk factor, discrimination across the board. And what's not talked about and what needs to be talked about is the trauma. Collective trauma, historical trauma, transgenerational trauma, microaggressive trauma, vicarious trauma. And the thing is mental health practitioners are generally taught that trauma is defined as actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. That's as per the American Psychiatric Association. But many are not trained to view racial trauma as a form of trauma. Racial trauma is a form of trauma. So let's talk about things that you can do to help. Oh, good, Dan's here right on time. Okay, and I'll mention who Dan is. I'll give him a shout out. This is a quote from Noel Quintana, Filipino who was slashed across the face in a subway in New York City. And he was cut across his face and he was asking for help, and there were people on the train and nobody helped him. Here's how we can help. This is something I like to, and please take it and share it, and let's just stop the hate and let's work together. So I like this, like I can see myself chanting in if I was protesting, stop the hate and collaborate. We need to work together. Solidarity, community organizing, community-led programs. And I want to talk about activism and versus reflectivism. A lot of people hear about activism, but do we really hear about reflectivism? So reflectivists and activism is, okay, you can protest and you can post things on social media, and I'm providing a webinar and things that you can do to be actively involved. But reflectivists, as a reflectivist, it's important to emphasize the significance of human self-awareness. The ways that I observe, I'm going to focus on myself, the ways I observe people. I imagine things, I describe things, predict and theorize about myself and the social reality around me. And the repeated effect my self-knowledge of these reflections have on my social reality. So this not only involves looking at our own biases, but really looking at how you can really make a difference, applying that knowledge. And one thing that this is my own personal viewpoint, my own standpoint, is not to increase police enforcement. As we know, BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color, There's a history of the police murdering marginalized populations. If you look at videos and those who are white that are handcuffed versus those who are Black, giving you an example, we know the end result, unfortunately. And so I really want to make sure that I put that out there as well. So what happens here is that Blacks are faced, sorry, it's asthma season. Blacks are faced with the challenge of creating and sustaining a positive racial reality, and Asian Americans are faced with the challenge of living up to the mono-minority myth. And then there's that struggle to maintain a positive identity while addressing what constitutes as a social reality. So that's where that reflectivism comes in. And so, yes, so if someone, someone may ask, okay, well then why are some of the acts happening where the perpetrator is Black, or why can't they work together historically? This may explain and provide you with some reason for that. And, again, part of reflectivism is educating yourself, educating others, and looking at not only your own, but other people's racial biases and holding them accountable. And so I wanted to just show you, this will be, and I think I'm going to ask Amelia if you can post it in the chat so that people can access this. I need to show you one more video. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to share my screen again. I want to show you this video one last time. This will be the last time I view this. There's no sound. There are 3 doormen. Nobody helped. They closed the door. I'm going to stop sharing and go back to my PowerPoint. That link, it would be great if Amelia can put it in the chat, because I think that's a really great article that includes all the videos. You can use it if you're sharing it with others and you want to educate others, but it lists all of the victims. If not, there's some of them, not all of them. And there is my favorite quote from Frederick Douglass: "In a composite nation like ours, as before the law, there should be no rich, no poor, no high, no low, no white, no Black, but common country, common citizenship, equal rights, and a common destiny." Asian Americans, yes.
We don't see your slides. I don't know if you're sharing them. But
Oh, that's fun. Okay, hold on.
okay.
I'll get back to you.
Thank you. There's usually a technological glitch.
You're welcome, and we see it now.
Okay, and this is the quote that I just read. And so Frederick Douglass, that's his, it's a quote that I came across that I said, that's perfect. I love it. That's exactly how I feel right now. If you look at, this is kind of like a timeline in a way, but this shows that working together must be done. And if you look at this, in 1869, Frederick Douglass advocated for Chinese and Japanese immigration. During the Philippine-American War, Black leaders and soldiers opposed to the US colonization. and also a lot of people don't know about Larry Itliong. He actually asked Mexican Cesar Chavez, everybody's heard of Cesar Chavez, which is fantastic, that's great, but they worked together in the famous Delano grape strike in 1965. African Americans protested against the Vietnam War. And again, I'm reading this for those who can't see the slides. Black and Japanese American activism, 1967 to 1971. Malcolm at my, one of the things that I really, as a special place in my heart, is Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama. The two became friends, helped each other develop local perspective on human rights. There's a mural, and the picture I did post that on the previous slide, that's in Harlem. Unfortunately, he died. She was with him and holding his head when he was killed. Grace Lee Boggs, Chinese American activist, married Black leader activist James Boggs. They worked together. So this is showing that we can do this. Unfortunately, Vincent Chin was killed in the 80s, beaten to death by 2 white auto workers who mistook him for Japanese and blamed Japan for the decline of the US automotive market. Black leader Jesse Jackson joined forces with the Asian American activists to demand justice, 1982. And then we have in 2020, Asian Americans support Black Lives Matter. This shows a snippet of that we can do this and that we need to do this. These are resources that I will be sharing with Amelia and that we can post. So, you know, for those who maybe want to, if you want to jot some down and you can see the screen, great, but we are going to share them. I'm sharing ones with you that you can check out right now. Dan, I posted, Dan is here. He's going to be, we're going to work together and doing some continuing education. And Dan works with the New York Coalition for Asian American Health, Asian American Mental Health. There's their website. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Stop AAPI Hate. There's also bystander intervention training. I will be taking that next week through Holla Back. And there's also, you can stream for free the documentary series on Asian Americans through the PBS website, and I have the link there. So these are some really great resources that you can start with. And through our continuing ed, we're going to be providing more resources. I want to thank everybody so much for being here. Please don't leave. We're going to have a discussion. If you can stay, would love to hear your questions and hear what you have to add. And I have, unfortunately, I just want to add one more thing. I've been spit on. I've been called chink numerous times, coronavirus bitch. So I reported the experiences I've had. And if you know of anybody who experienced them, please share with them. Stop AAPI Hate. Help them to report these so that we have the data and that we can get help, and because something needs to be done. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Anybody have any questions? And I'm just I might read some of these aloud. I'm just going to screen through them. While being in solidarity with Black sisters and brothers for Black Lives Matter and fighting against white supremacy, how can we also address anti-Asian crimes done by non-white populations? And it goes the same way. How can we address anti-Black among Asian American populations to obtain genuine solidarity among minorities? And that's something that we need to do, in that we need to educate and work in small communities, and starting small and then building from there, getting in touch with these organizations and working with them. It's something where we're not, you know, if we're not going to be able to, it's like, basically, let me look at it this way. You're throwing in a pebble and it's sending out a ripple effect. It's one thing to just post something on social media, but it's another thing to really actually reinforce this, holding people accountable and gravitating and working towards those who are also in it, who want to do the same thing. There are people who are going to say that they don't support it, and all we can do is try to educate them. And I had this conversation with actually one of my clients, and they were asking the same exact question. So this question is awesome, Irang, in that, I hope I'm saying your name right, in that, you know, this is something where we can make a difference. Now we have to remember that we're not responsible for anybody else's behavior but our own, but we can serve as role models. And that's where education comes in, starting with educating ourselves and then educating others. And it will make a difference. We just have to be patient and make a change. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shani. Shani, I'm sorry. Also, if somebody wants to, you can unmute and you can ask a question. That's great. Okay, thanks. I'm so glad when I pronounce names correctly. That's great. Thank you. But if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, or if it's more private and you want to send it a different way, that would be great. Somebody is asking, that's a great question. I love that. How do we address this, starting with children? One of the things is, yes, you know, there's dolls, but one of the things that I love, for example, is for example, if you look at Disney, right? I just watched Mulan, by the way, just saying. I just watched Mulan the other day, not that long ago, for the first time. Someone said, you didn't see it? No. And that you can have these discussions, but I appreciate that question so much, Rebecca, because that's something that I wanted to mention, is that one of the things that I was never taught as a child was how to deal with racism. And it's a discussion that we need to have with our children. It needs to happen at home. It needs to happen in the classroom. And I can feel myself getting really passionate about it, so I'm going to back down a little bit. But this is a discussion that needs to be had. It cannot be swept under the rug. And so when we have these discussions with children, yes, there's a way that you can go about it. And I like maybe using dolls, using things that kids can really understand, using some of the Disney movies, right? Back in the 90s, they had Pocahontas, now they have Mulan, and then they have the new one that's coming out, Moana, right? So using something that they can identify with would be very, very helpful. Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth gives me permission to be passionate about it, so I will. So I appreciate the support, guys. And just by you being here is very, very moving. Yes, if you don't talk about racism, BIPOC children internalize it. There's the internalized oppression. Yes. And then when it happens, they don't know how to manage it. I just also watched, I like TV and movies, can you tell? It helps me to unwind at the end of the day. If anybody saw This Is Us? No, A Million Little Things. There was the most recent episode of A Million Little Things, and they actually touched upon that. And I found that to be really, that was a really, really great thing that yeah, it is also about representation in movies and TV. Absolutely. Those who are mental health providers, perhaps you have some questions as to, you may not have an Asian client, but what about your coworkers? What about family? Yes, they do. Yes, Shawnee, absolutely. Thank you. I hope I pronounced it right. Yes. Yeah, I watched those two shows. Thank you.
Kari, so, I had a message from someone, and they were asking, if you're a clinician, are you able to talk about, do you see clients who are Asian, and are they coming in more because of the increase of the hate crimes?
There is actually a demand for Asian mental health providers, and there's not enough of us to go around. And that also is, there's not a lot of, and that's something that we're going to be working towards in the NASW, is there are some Asian subgroups within the divisions. And that's what we're working towards as well, because there's not a lot of Asian social workers. There are some, but not a lot, not enough to go around. And I thank whoever asked that question. I embrace you. Because that actually is an issue. I get asked a lot. Am I available? And with telehealth, it's a lot easier, but unfortunately we do see that there's not enough. And so we see that there's like I was mentioning, that high dropout rate. And so there are certain things that a lot of the clinicians need to be trained in about racial trauma, for example. And also about, excuse me, and also about, if you are meeting with someone who's Asian or Asian American, psychotherapy may not apply to them. Did you know, for example, I just recently learned within the past couple of years that there's actually, because psychology in a way and psychiatry is colonizing, right? So it promotes white, colonization to mental health in an Asian culture. So what we are trained with here in the United States may not apply to working with the Asian population. So it's something where, I really applaud you for being here. And we will be doing those continuing education, presentations, so that way that can work with you and help you. So I'm just going through the chat really quick. I'll try to read them aloud as much as possible. I was thanked for acknowledging Yom HaShoah. Yes, genocide, absolutely. Rebecca, I am Filipino, but I'm Filipino and Jewish, by the way. My mom's Jewish, so I am probably I'm not the only one, I'm so happy, but my religion is Judaism, and I am Filipino. So I am very sensitive to that. I also saw The Pianist this weekend, and that was difficult to get through. Thank you so much, Rebecca, who also thanked me for talking about the implications of the US laws and attitudes and beliefs relating to Asian women and fetishism. Yes, absolutely. Hi, Dan. I'm glad that you're here, Dan. And, you know, if you want to unmute your mic and say hi, that would be fantastic. So at least people can, you know, if that's, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm just so happy you're here.
Hi, everyone. I just social work myself with Verizon, so I'm glad I'm here. I'm with the Neuro Coalition for Asian American Mental Health.
Woohoo! Yes, thank you. And I was asked if I saw Jennifer's question. I don't think I did.
Wants to know how she can volunteer time. She's Korean American and she wants to help.
Oh, that's fantastic. I don't want to put Jennifer on the spot, but if she's in New York, I can, if you want to give her my private email address, I can share with her some organizations in New York. And if anybody else would like that, I can absolutely provide that. It was just so many, like I have a long list of organizations you can be involved with. That is an amazing example. And thank you, Jennifer, for that, in getting involved in the community and volunteering. If you can. It is a pandemic and I know a lot of people are busy, so just reaching out. I know that some organizations are looking for donations, but you know, a lot of people are strapped right now financially, so donating your time is just as important. There is a question I wanted to address. Clinicians who experience racism and racial microaggressions from clients, what is something we can do to support our colleagues? Listen. And I love that question because I did do continuing ed on that. One of the things that you can do to support that person is to listen and hear what they have to say, validate their feelings. No, you're not their therapist, but the worst thing that we can do is invalidate the person's feelings. Is there any way to encourage those from the Asian American community to join the social work path and gain a better variety? Well, that's a great question, Kim. If you look at education, there are, and you know, there's some colleges that foster that and there's some that do not. You're in Florida. Okay, we can still try to help you with there are organizations in Florida. So yeah, Sam, if you wouldn't mind just sending Jennifer my private email, and then Jennifer, please email me, I'll work with you on that. If there's a way to encourage those to join the social work path, it really depends on, because there's so many different subgroups. The thing is to be a little bit transparent and blatant all at the same time, is social work is not a lucrative profession, and psychology is. And so it's getting there, it's getting better, but I think that with the latter generations, we're starting to see that that's happening. So there's that negative stigma that's interwoven with mental health care. Tensions about various cultures. Feel free to post your question. Absolutely. A question about tensions within various cultures. Okay. And the thing is, and if you're in New York, I can, oh, hi, Cedra. Okay. You have my email address. I'll definitely share that with you. Okay. Oh, I love it. Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys. If you have, and you know, feel free to help each other out and post your resources in the chat. Yes, thank you, Julie. I appreciate it. And Dan, thank you so much. Yes, Dan is posting. Thank you, Dan. Please email Dan. He is posting asianmentalhealth.org. Absolutely. Social worker in Oregon. Yes, third generation. Thank you, Bianca. I know I have some colleagues out by you. So happy. And thank you, Bianca. I'm just going through the chat. There's a lot. Amelia, can you help me? I'm just reaching. There's so many of them. It's fantastic.
There is quite a bit. Okay, let me see. I see one here from Sophia that is about a conversation that happened in her family that is racist, and how to address those conversations when they happen in your family. So I think maybe, how do you speak up how do you like interrupt racism, both I would say as it's happening to someone, as well as when it's happening within your family, or those, you know, private door conversations that people might be willing to let those things go, but you don't want to allow that to happen.
I love that question because that not only applies to working with, in talking about Asian Americans, but that also applies to any marginalized population, BIPOC and whatnot. And so if you look at somebody who says something, now you have to really consider the source, because if you're in a grocery store and somebody says something, is it really worth you getting, God forbid, attacked and you respond to them? But if it's a family member, or if it's somebody that you have a close relationship with, just as if I'm role playing, that's interesting. Why would you say that? What do you mean by that? Basically, reflecting it back to them, holding them accountable. You're not taking that. You're reflecting it back to them. And if it gives them an opportunity, you're giving them the benefit of the doubt. You're giving them the opportunity to explain themselves, but also you're holding a mirror to them where they have to basically then be held. You're holding them accountable in effect. That's interesting. Why would you say that? But also it depends on your tone, right? So sometimes if you can say it with a smile, as hard as it may be, and really setting those boundaries. So we need to have these conversations with people. There are some people who just don't know better. This is how they were raised. This is what they truly believe. And we need to do that. Thank you so much for posting all of these amazing resources. Yes, there are tensions within Asian subgroups as well. There are. But again, as we're assimilating and as the generations are getting older, second, third, fourth even generations, we're more becoming assimilated. And I find that the tensions are not really as much as they were amongst the older generations, because colonization does play a role. For example, Japanese and Chinese colonized the Philippines, right? So of course there's going to be some tensions, but just because they're there doesn't mean that we need to hold to them anymore. We can break that barrier down.
I also have a question here from Laura in Fulton, Missouri. What do you see as needs specific to rural communities? I believe that would be, yeah.
Unfortunately, when you look at rural communities, it depends. I'm out here on Long Island where, there's certain, Long Island is something specific in that it is the most segregated place in the United States. There are red lines that you wouldn't believe. So for example, there's a large Asian community in certain parts of Long Island. I won't mention them. I don't want to call anybody out. And I live in one where there is starting to be an Asian community moving in, which I'm really happy about. But there's others where there's not. So we have those throughout the United States. And when you're in a rural community, if you're living in it, it's one thing. Whereas if you're working with a client who's living in it, it's another thing. So it's a really broad answer to a really detailed, it's just a really tough question that's like a whole continuing ed session, I think, that we can talk about. Yeah, so thank you for that question though. I'm honestly, if you had a client who's in a rural community, as best as they can, get them connected to an organization, even if it's not within their own neighborhood. So for example, you're in Long Island, well then what about Queens, right? If they're Asian. Also looking at their own profession, what their background is. If they're a medical provider, there's nurses, doctors, physical therapists, maybe where they're an alumni at the college. So like the idea is, you need to be creative with helping them.
I just got a direct message, and it was someone asking about, and Kari can help me answer this question as well, asking about, we do something at the New York State chapter called Revolutionize Social Work, which is addressing racism and in social work specifically. And they were asking that we ever include anti-Asian hate in our Revolutionize Social Work. And to be clear, absolutely yes. The Revolutionize Social Work is about all racism and oppression that exists in social work. They asked if we could have a section that talks about how racism and white supremacy shows up in social work, specifically how social workers who are Asian experience it within social work. So I just want to say that we do definitely include that. We want anyone who comes from a marginalized or oppressed community to feel comfortable speaking up in those sessions. And it is intentionally for you know, all people of color, Asian, Black, Indigenous. You know, we have folks on our leadership committee of all different demographics. So I want to let you know that that's definitely a place that we can speak about these things, and I encourage you to come and join us in that. Kari, if there's also anything that you want to add to that.
Yeah, actually, all three of us, Sam, Amelia, and myself, are and others, we're involved in facilitating those discussions, and we have done that. And I, whoever asked that question, I'm sorry that I don't know your name, but you know, we always post it. We have one next month. I believe it's Monday, Sam, May 17th. Yeah, it's my good memory. It's Monday, May 17th at 6 o'clock. And I highly recommend that you sign up. I'm really going to try to move my clients around so that I can attend that. And so, you know, please feel safe to bring that up, and our facilitators will definitely open up to that discussion. We're actually going to be discussing being a bystander. How can we help? So that would definitely fit our discussion. So I urge you to definitely attend. We will absolutely discuss that. I have been asked, I know we're running short on time. Have I experienced discrimination or stereotyping in my workplace? Absolutely. And moving towards creating a safe space, there are colleagues that I have that I feel safe with, that I have a discussion with, and I also do, you know, I do seek out support outside of that. So I no longer stay silent. I have to share it. My chairperson at my job, when I was spit on, she said, you have to report that. And I at the time, I didn't even know what the heck she meant. And because of her, I did. And yes, Val Vincent, thank you. Please address that Asian Americans are also dealing with generational trauma. Yes, I did do that. Absolutely. I did mention that. In addition to, I read like a long list, but I went really fast. So I got you, Val Vincent. I did. Absolutely. There is generational trauma. That wasn't my presentation, and we're going to be going over that in continuing education sessions. So I really hope you can join us again. And I thank you, and thank your, you know, dad for his service. Thank you so much. And so, and they posted the links in the chat for the Racial Justice Forum, Revolutionizing Social Work, April 22nd. So we're really providing a lot of that. It's really up to those who are voicing about wanting Asian representation. It's up to us to say something. Please speak up. I need help with that. So I'm specifically asking you to help out, and please, yes. Cherry blossoms, by the way, they are symbolic in the Japanese culture this time of year, and that is from one of the colleges on Long Island. So I thought that would be really pretty. And there's also squirrels behind me too, but I don't know if you can see them. There's a squirrel there. Anyway, I thank everybody so very much. Please reach out to me and Dan, and also attend our future workshop, continuing ed workshops. And I think we'll wrap it up so that people can go and enjoy the rest of their evening. Please take care of yourself. This wasn't exactly a comfortable conversation, but I do appreciate you making the time to be here. Thank you.
We really, really appreciate the work you do here at the chapter. We're so happy to have Dan jumping in and joining you and doing some of this work. And yes, I hope that everyone joins us at the Revolution and at our forums, because your voice is incredibly important and we want to hear from you. So have a great evening, and thanks for joining us.